Welcome to this concurrent session, Individual and Community Trauma and Resilience, Impact on Equity and Inclusion. I'm Dina Hilton, Chief Administrative Officer at Hope Health and the Board Secretary for Eat Smart Move More South Carolina. This breakout session will focus on current understandings about the intersectionality of trauma, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Individual and community trauma both have a huge impact on brain and physical health and health behaviors. Almost 3 decades of research on adverse childhood events has revealed a relationship between childhood trauma and our health on numerous levels that impact current diverse communities with inequity and exclusion. Today's speaker is Dr. Shirley Heisman, Assistant Professor of Social Work at Columbia College in Columbia, South Carolina. I hope you all enjoy this session.
I also want to quickly introduce Dr. Peter Mitchell, President Emeritus of Columbia College. He's going to be interviewing me today.
Thank you, Shirley. And we are honored to have you join us today and are very excited about the Eat Smart, Move More South Carolina and its Leadership Summit. And the topic you've chosen is certainly one that is dear to our hearts. We're going to be talking about the individual and community trauma and resilience, and that's impact on equity and inclusion. We set up a few goals for ourselves. The first few are going to be really a summary of some of the key issues in the field of trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and the impact of trauma and violence on a community. Then we're going to spend most of our time identifying the risk factors at the individual, family, and community level. And then the flip side of those, obviously, are understanding the resilience factors that can address those risk factors. Ultimately, we're going to try to develop a framework for all of us to see how each of us are working together, collaborating to prevent community trauma and to build resilience. And then throughout the program, we're going to try to link the impact of trauma on equity and inclusion. And we'll be speaking specifically about BIPOC and LGBTQIA communities and the impact on women, which is disproportionate. So Shirley, tell us about trauma.
So there are a number of definitions of trauma out in the field. And the first one you see on the slide is by the American Psychological Association. I am brought back up to a broader lens with that, and I include an experience that exceeds an individual or community's emotional and mental capacity to cope. So it is a little bit more inclusive and takes into account that there are things that may not be quite as notable as the events in the first definition, but that are very impactful on the person and the community.
And it also shows how important it is for organizations like those that are taking part in this summit to see how we work together in resolving it at the community level.
Yes, yes.
The brain is really the key to all of this, Shirley. Please spend some time talking about the brain basics and the brain implications of trauma.
Yeah, so as infants, we come into the world with relatively few neurons, pathways, and synapses, the biology of the brain. Our brains develop in response to the environment in which we live. So it's not just an internal blank slate that somehow gets made up. It is always in response to the environment, in our interactions with the environment. Over time, throughout childhood, neuronal pathways that are not used, the brain prunes those pathways. It takes them away because they're not being useful or used. And brains also develop from the back of the brain, the amygdala, which is where our fight or flight responses come from, to the front, or cerebral cortex, where reasoning, critical thinking, and judgment develop. And this is a relatively lengthy process. So we know that development isn't essentially complete until about age 25. So you can imagine that earlier in life, that whole process is taking time and developing very complexly, and there can be lots of time for things to go wrong in that process or be altered. What we do know is that when children are in consistently chaotic environments, growth patterns beyond that amygdala are disrupted. So beyond the fight or flight response, moving into more reasoned thinking, that process becomes altered. During traumatic events, the amygdala kicks into high gear and produces much greater levels of our body's steroid, cortisol. And we all know that on consistently high levels of steroids, we have lots of evidence that people in different sports areas are dramatically affected by the presence of consistently high steroids. And so in terms of child development, as those steroids remain at a very high level, our brains remain on high alert and we experience anxiety. We also know that from studies on infant sleep patterns for babies who are living in chaotic environments, very chaotic homes, their sleep patterns are different than the babies who are living in more calm homes.
Well, and I think, Shirley, what this means to me is that this is a process that begins so early and we don't realize the impact, and those impacts will come to play much later in life in behaviors that are reaching out as a result of trauma.
Exactly. And the field of epigenetics tells us that that starts in utero. So the brain's development then becomes stuck and a child remains in that hypervigilant, anxious and fearful place, which can display as aggression or passivity, or a child just looking blank, looking dissociated in many ways. So it's difficult for the brain to develop when the amygdala is in charge like that. The process of developing patience and problem solving, critical thinking skills, and healthy judgment all become compromised. And we can all think of news stories where, what would appear to be a minor conflict between adolescents, such as fighting over the controller for a video game, can result in a conflict so huge that someone pulls out a gun and shoots the other one, right? It really is a 0 to 60 in no time at all process when that amygdala is constantly in charge.
So it's almost as though these middle schoolers that might engage in that kind of behavior, they've just never had the opportunity in the brain development to have the problem solving and the critical thinking skills. So they go from a confrontation to an attack. And
Yes.
these are part of the manifestations of brain issues.
Yes, exactly.
Now, key to all of this has been the ACEs study, and this has really been a landmark study and has had profound impact in so many arenas.
Yes.
Tell us about how important that is.
So the ACEs study goes back into the 1990s, and it really originates out of the work of Dr. Felitti and Dr. Ande. Dr. Felitti was working with Kaiser Permanente in a weight loss clinic for people who were suffering from extreme obesity, and designing programs and plans for people to help them in their health plan. And what they began to notice is that at a certain point, there were a number of these folks who had been very successful in their weight loss program and had been achieving their goals, who suddenly just dropped out of the program. And so they began to look at this as a secondary sort of area of interest, and of course did interviews with these folks, follow-up interviews. And they had a whole bank of questions that they would ask folks who had dropped out of the program, and ranging from all kinds of things about their childhoods to current health practice and so forth. And at one point, Dr. Felitti had asked a patient, at what age did you become sexually active? And the client, or the patient rather, thought that he had asked, what weight were you when you became sexually active? And she reported 70 pounds. And he thought, this cannot be true. And so he asked a little bit more, and indeed, she had been 70 pounds of weight when she had been first sexually active, clearly against her own consent. And these are patterns that they began seeing in these folks who were dropping out of this study. And a long-term impact, or the long-term outcomes of those studies, began to suggest that there's a correlation between adverse childhood events and chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance use problems, and that the impact of those issues have a huge impact on children's ability to engage in education, their readiness to be engaged in the workforce at some point, and overall lifetime earnings are dramatically impacted by ACEs. And the interesting thing is that these are preventable. So we know that 1.9 million cases of heart disease and 21 million cases of depression could be potentially avoided by preventing ACEs. And we know that out of data coming out of the CDC.
Well, and how do those ACEs, they distribute them? And there's about 9 or 10 of the key factors?
Yes, there are 10. And the first area is abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual, neglect, physical and emotional, and then household dysfunction. So cases of mental illness in a family member, having an incarcerated relative, having domestic violence, substance abuse present, and the process of divorce can often be traumatic for children.
And the sheer fact that half of them are out of household dysfunction shows us the importance of services that need to come to the families and the individuals to help avoid this.
Absolutely. And we know that 1 in 7 people in our country is affected by at least one ACE. And so this affects a very large portion of the population.
Now, did you say 70% have had at least one ACE?
Yes.
It's pretty compelling.
Yes.
And we can see from the pyramid that unfortunately, it's a direct line from conception to death. And if you're in a situation of historical trauma, which would then ultimately lead to the social conditions of your local context, which reinforce that. So that's why you have these adverse childhood experiences, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. That disrupts your development of your neurodevelopment. Then that produces obviously the social, emotional, and cognitive impairment that you described earlier. Those are the same people who want to then take risk behaviors that have a negative impact on their health and well-being, which again produces the disease, the disability, and the social problems. And the top, unfortunately, is not a positive figure, it's an early death. So you see how all of this is interrelated.
And if you go to the Children's Trust of South Carolina web resources, you can actually drill down to your particular county to see the percentage of people in your county who have been impacted by ACEs, and those connections or correlations to smoking, and all the way down to not wearing your seatbelt, which is a health risk, right?
Yeah, and it's often, I've read that research too, Shirley, and it's often 4 or 5 times higher
Yes.
predominance of smoking or dangerous behaviors than would be
Yes.
for a person with only 1 or possibly 2 adverse childhood experiences.
Exactly.
So this would be a good time, Shirley, for you to give us kind of a little bit of a summary of trauma before we move into dealing with it directly.
Right. So again, we know that it's pervasive. 7 out of 10 people have at least one trauma, one ACE, that it's very significant impact on the development of health and well-being. We are beginning to understand a lot more about polyvictimization and complex trauma, recognizing that oftentimes where there is one ACE, there's more ACEs, and that within communities, there are very high-risk communities for trauma where there's been intergenerational racism that's been perpetrated upon the community, the impact of white supremacy, and that we also know that trauma-informed care is becoming the standard of care, at least in the individual level. And again, it's primarily at this point addressing individual trauma with a disproportionate impact on vulnerable communities, women, BIPOC, and the LGBTQIA communities. So it impacts the general population, but there are portions of the population which are at much higher risk.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the trauma-informed care came primarily out of the social work and the medical fields. But educators, fortunately, have adopted this. They typically call it trauma-informed practices, but it's really the same concept. And what's intriguing to me as I look at the field is places where you're seeing also in the beginnings of it in the criminal justice and law enforcement field.
Yes.
Business, so much of what's happening in business and industry, so many of the issues they're facing are trauma induced. And if business can be more attuned to it, and when we started looking at it on campus, we had the arts faculty say, hey, what about us?
Mm-hmm.
Don't you think that most of drama and theater and dance and music, don't you think that has a strong impact of trauma on its creation? So you can see that it's truly, it touches almost every part of society, but indeed it is disproportionate in by LGBTQA and the women. Yes,
and we also know that it affects women of color in such powerful ways. For instance, the level of maternal and infant health that's directly affected by these risk factors is huge. The infant mortality rate for African American babies is twice that of non-Hispanic white babies. And the complications that African American mothers can find themselves in the process of their pregnancy and in childbirth is just so much greater than the white non-Hispanic population as well.
It really is an issue of social justice.
It is a very big issue of social justice. Yes, yes.
So let's bring it now from the more individual to the community level.
Yeah. So mental health expert Dr. George Albee says no epidemic has ever been resolved by paying attention to the treatment of the affected individual. And we, of course, all know that the story of the babies coming down the river and people are pulling the babies out of the river, and somebody finally decides to go upriver to see who's throwing all the babies in the river to begin with. And that's really the lessons that we're learning about trauma, right? It's what's happening that puts people at risk for these kinds of things to happen to them. We also know that it isn't just individuals who directly witness or experience violence. We know that there's vicarious impacts of this for service providers, first responders, and certainly residents of high violence communities. The result is really that the levels of trauma reach across the population, and they break down what social networks there are, social relationships suffer, and the presence of positive social norms becomes eroded because it becomes like a snowball. It gets bigger and bigger, and it begins to break down what we would normally consider strengths in a community. That is due to no one individual's behavior, but is due to this impact of trauma on a community. So we know from research and in practice that in high violence neighborhoods, whole communities are traumatized. And very recently, there's been this shift from understanding trauma not just as an individual issue, but as a collective issue. So it is often the barrier to effective solutions to promote health and safety and well-being, just like those middle schoolers who have no problem-solving abilities because the amygdala is in such high gear. The community is also in that place of being very fearful, being very anxious, and reacting to things either aggressively or with violence. Community trauma symptoms, we see those in the socio-cultural, the physical and built, and the economic environment. So we see them in all three areas.
And we're going to drill down more into those three areas, yes, and they become the framework for our model for community reacting to trauma and building resilience.
Yes. So emerging practices that address community trauma include indigenous-based healing and restorative justice practices. It's only recently that these frameworks have started to develop, and there's certainly an uneven level of capacity to conceptualize and address community trauma. So you have to really bring people along into this understanding of how this happens and what it looks like. And then understanding, of course, the historical and cultural ramifications of racism and inequity and limited opportunities and oppression. That again strikes me as a woman from the North, the snowball effect. It just begins to get bigger and bigger and much more difficult to handle. And it becomes deeper. So the school to prison pipeline, for instance, is a piece of all of those sorts of historical and cultural trends.
Well, and that's why I think I was so pleased that, Eat Smart, Move More SC chose that as the theme. It's
yes.
Communities, but it also the historical and cultural implications.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about, help us to understand more about the relation of trauma to violence itself.
So violence and the threat of violence, the loss of consequence of violence, and structural violence are all contributing factors to individual and community level trauma. So at the individual level, of course, we see individuals with symptoms, including re-experiencing the trauma, emotional numbing, avoidance, and increased arousal and or aggression. But at the community level, we see it really within what we talk about as three interrelated clusters. The people cluster, the social cultural environment, where we see relationships breaking down and loss of intergenerational relationships, distrust. The place cluster, the physical built environment, which we'll talk a little bit about next, and the equitable opportunity cluster, the economic environment. So those are the three areas that we look at the community level and when trying to understand the impact of trauma and how to build resilience back.
And it's the interrelated nature of it that makes it both so difficult at one level and yet so essential at another.
Exactly, yes.
Let's break those three down, if you could.
Right. So when we look at the community level with the people cluster, we're going to see damaged and fragmented, torn social relations, particular again, intergenerational relationships. We're going to see damaged or broken social networks or the loss of those social networks, including like what happens to children after school when there's no place to go and the neighborhood is affected by trauma and there aren't people hanging out in their porches to look after each other's kids. The infrastructure of social support really is what we're talking about here. And that the destructive and dislocating social norms that promote or encourage violence and unhealthy behaviors start to take over because of the levels of trauma and the responses to traumatic experiences, instead of what we would normally consider community-oriented positive social norms, and then a low sense of collective and political and social efficacy. So these are communities that understandably so have very little political activity or involvement. And many times it's because what is happening right in front of them right now is so demanding of attention that to think about bigger issues of policy and people who hold office in politics becomes simply a luxury that many folks don't have time or energy to think about. And what we see at the place cluster, of course, is deteriorated urban environments many times, often unhealthy and dangerous public spaces that have not been kept up or have become unsafe zones for children and families. Crumbling infrastructure of streets and sidewalks and buildings and housing stock. And of course, the availability and promotion of unhealthy products without the availability of healthy products. So we see businesses and resources such as grocery stores that can provide healthy produce, fresh produce, leaving communities, and we're left with 7-Elevens and Burger Kings and so forth, providing unhealthy products as far as nutrition is concerned. And then
that's one of the importance of why groups like Eat Smart, Move More.
Yes.
Because we've got to get out of these food deserts.
Yes.
And then the final category is the equitable, the economic piece.
Yes. So of course, because much of this is historical and intergenerational trauma and oppression and discrimination, we have the intergenerational poverty, the long-term unemployment, intergenerational unemployment, the relocation of businesses and corporations and jobs out of communities that need them. And that leaves limited employment opportunities, and the government and private industry or in private sectors have disinvested from these communities, leaving so little economic resources to work with to help build things back up.
So let's get into the risk factors. We'll take a quick look at the individual and family ones because we want to focus more on how they relate to the community level.
Yes. So at the individual level, of course, we see families experiencing challenges related to children with special needs, caregiving challenges, little services for people with mental health issues, chronic physical illnesses that occur because the dangers in the environment can be so horrific. Children and youth who don't feel close to caregivers and feel like they can't talk to them about their feelings. And often this is because caregivers and parents are highly stressed and anxious. Early engagement in sexual activity. So when you're lost and lonely and you're craving attention from someplace, and adults are dealing with trauma and the struggles of day-to-day life in poverty, we reach out to other kinds of sources of attention. Children and youth who are engaged in aggressive and delinquent behavior is often a risk factor. And families of caregivers who have a limited understanding of children's needs or development. And again, I think that is an economic privilege to have that understanding. And when we're living in poverty, those again are luxuries. Caregivers who they themselves were abused or neglected as children, and families with young caregivers or single parents. So children raising children in many cases, because of all of these community issues that come along with community trauma.
Well, and I think I need us to move a little bit quicker through this because I want to get to the community piece, but you can just see the list here that it's all those areas that we knew are going to be vulnerable.
Yes.
And who lack the resources, intellectual, financial, and community support that to enable them to address them. So you've got the high risk factors for the individual, and then really the community risk factors are just those individuals writ large.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly.
Yes, that's exactly right.
You get the violence and the poverty and the unemployment, and then of course that leads to the access to the drugs, and all of it becomes this constant spiral. But the other piece, Shirley, that you've seen, and it relates to the topic, is it produces these stereotypes. Communities that are perceived, BIPOC communities, LGBTQIA, they then get stereotyped in negative ways, and we wonder why there isn't the governmental support or the investment business and industry.
Precisely.
And the downward spiral.
Yes, precisely. Yep. So communities where neighbors don't know or look out for each other, few community activities, unstable housing, frequent moves, food insecurity, high levels of social and environmental disorder, with trauma at the root cause with many of these communities that are marked by poverty.
And I think that's if there's a message to come out of our presentation, is we've got to address trauma because it truly is a root cause, not just for the marginalized communities, but for poverty, for the very areas that all of us who are watching this are trying to actively make a difference and change and improve.
Exactly.
So the flip side, there are resilience factors. There are ways of doing this.
Yeah. So what does resilience look like, right? It can be seen in safe and stable and nurturing relationships. It's a social construct. So positive friendships, networks, the opportunity to succeed in school, caring adult supervision, basic needs being met, caregivers who are able to obtain an education, seek employment that allows them to work in more fulfilling sorts of work and provides them with more information about parenting and child development. So families where caregivers have steady employment. Looks like we've got 15 minutes left.
Okay. Well, it's the old standby. It takes a village to educate. It takes a village to address the trauma that's there.
Absolutely. Yes. And then again, individual and family resilience factors. You can see those. We won't go through them because we want to get to the community pieces here.
But again, don't underestimate the importance of having those positive experiences, the fun.
Yeah.
When things get so frustrated, they lose sight of what's important.
Yes.
So then let's take it to the community level. So how do we interact with the community?
So communities where families have access to economic and financial help. I'm always stunned when you ride through certain communities, there's not a bank to be found within sight. but there are title loan companies everywhere. So it is a predatory financial situation. Medical care and mental health services being available, access to safe housing, childcare, and especially preschool, one of the foundational pieces of education that we know has such an impact.
And these, again, diverse groups can address these diverse issues.
Yes. And then again, more resilience factors, engaging after school programs, work opportunities, strong partnerships in the community, residents feeling connected to each other, where violence isn't tolerated, and where diversity, equity, and inclusion are celebrated. Difference is celebrated rather than scorned.
Well, and I think many of those who are on this in this session right now are doing these very things through their organization.
Yes, yes, yes.
So now we get the community framework, and again we go back to those 3 building blocks, and the socio-cultural is the first piece.
Right.
And again, we will have a copy of this report for you to take in greater depth, but it's just that whole idea that there is an environment of people, and that you need to address that and to rebuild the social relationships, the social fiber of the community. You need to change that narrative about the community and the people who live in it, so those stereotypes aren't continually perpetuated and repeated. And you need to organize those folks around positive community activity. These are some of the ways in which but the importance of cultural identity. And again, going back to the theme of our conference, this is critical to building upon that positive cultural identity.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And then the physical built environment, improving the quality of the physical environment, public spaces, built housing stock being improved, safer places for families and children to congregate and play, improving and reclaiming those spaces for the community is so critical.
And then the economic, and we talked quite a bit about that, but it is that restorative justice program that shifts the norms.
Yeah.
And it's the fostering of the economic development and workforce development strategies, and teaching people and getting them ready for jobs, and then moving those jobs in, and promoting the empowerment zones that we think are so important in workforce development. All of these are a part of the network of that. So that gives us a model that we've got 2 parts to. And you can see pretty much we tried to make it as graphic as possible, borrowing from some authors that we've noted later on. But you can see the interaction of the people, the place, and the equitable opportunities.
That all, as well as individual approaches, those all lean towards reducing individual and community trauma and reducing that risk of violence or the threat of violence. And you can see in the next slide, of course, it increases the well-being for individuals, families, and communities. Those are the things we've been talking about throughout this, but adequate living wages, quality education, producing local wealth. So those are the things that are going to come along as that resilience is built by all of the efforts by the different entities involved in this conference.
Yeah, people building trust and willingness to act for the common good, and
Mm-hmm.
the safe places. All of those are so interrelated and yet so important.
Yes, yeah. Just a couple of examples. There is the example of Roxbury, Massachusetts, where there is an ongoing community development project, which has been in the works since the 70s and before, but those are built around concepts of safety and trustworthiness, collaboration, having the community involvement in making a plan to better the community, providing choice, empowering people to be involved, and having efficacy in their own environments, with, of course, consideration for cultural, historical, and gender issues and identities.
And this is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. What is that? Maybe 20 years old now?
Maybe 30.
Yeah, maybe 30. And they've stepped in and they've really developed these pillars and key priorities. And that's what the Roxbury Community Development Project did.
Yes, yes.
And we have the website for that. It's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
Tell a little bit about it, Shirley, because it's really.
Yeah. So it was a typical story of a community where white flight had taken place and de-investment in the community by businesses and banks had happened, redlining of property and lending rates to people in these communities. And it was just an overall crumbling of infrastructure that had such a negative effect on people who were living there. And they formed a community, basically a community board that began to look at these issues and giving power to the people who lived in that community, involving them in the process of making things change and making sure that other entities from the outside didn't come over and take over, was such a critical link to them beginning to make change. So it is an amazing story. If you get a chance to take a look at it, there's 2 documentaries actually, but this website will lead you to the overall story.
Well, and on a smaller, more manageable level, this is what we've been trying to do at Columbia College.
Yes, yes.
And for us, safety is a campus-wide commitment. We believe it's important to have a psychologically safe place. The trustworthiness is the response to the murder of George Floyd. This was a wake-up call for so many organizations, and we've had in our mission statement for over 30 years now social justice as one of the 3 pillars, along with leadership and service as major outcomes. And so what we did is we started talking to each other and listening to each other. We created a special social justice task force of faculty, staff, and of trustees. And they brought a plan, a 7-point plan to the Board of Trustees at its summer retreat. And the board accepted it. And so it was a collaborative effort of trustworthiness and choice. And those 7 initiatives, they were given the go-ahead as to engage in that. And it's one of those classics. We all listened to each other. The students had important lessons to tell us, and the faculty and the staff. And the other important piece was the recognition of the historical, cultural, and gender. I was the interim president. I had been president for 9 years back in the 90s. And I came in right when COVID started. But when the George Floyd thing happened, I had heard so much about this statue we had of Andrew Jackson. And it's huge, 10 foot by 10 foot, Anna Hyatt Huntington, a major piece of art. And yet it brought such difficult feelings to our Black and brown students. So I worked with the board, and in a 2-day period, we took it down. I mean, we put it in a safe location and all of that. But those are the kinds of specific tasks that you can take. And I think the end result was, as we developed this, we created this institute for building resilience through trauma-informed practices. And it's involved in teacher education and in social work, but we're also now taking it into criminal justice, into our business program, and even into our program for the arts. So it's our way of trying to address promoting a community on campus of resilience. And then the final theme of the program today is trauma, equity, and inclusion. And certainly this is your great passion, Shirley.
Yeah. So we are firm believers that addressing the trauma is a form of social justice, and it is a means of bringing people back into the conversation who've been cut out of that conversation for centuries. And addressing mental health and trauma will allow people to, again, re-engage, but it's going to take the whole community. I mean, communities of trauma cannot do this just on their own. It's going to take the investment of all of us. We can't do that individually. And I think I've talked a little bit about the African-American women and the issue of their vulnerability in pregnancy and childbirth. But we know at the cellular level that Black women are approximately 10 years older than their chronological age. And largely, there's a correlation there between the trauma of over 300 years of white supremacy, racial and economic oppression, and discrimination. So they are tied. They are tied together.
I've had some conversations with some people who weren't sure that we really have, quote unquote, systematic racism. and systemic racism. And I said, let me give you a statistic. If you want some specific evidence of that being very prevalent, certainly that statistic of an African-American woman 10 years older than her cellular age. That's powerful.
Yeah, yeah. And again, that manifests in health issues, higher infant mortality rates, lower life expectancies of both men and women of color. It means that people cannot live up to their highest potential or contribution, that makes the connection between building resilience and trauma-informed practices and social justice so profound. Not only do these groups risk trauma and mental health conditions to a higher degree than others, but it also gets passed on down to the generations. It is
Well, and there's some good news. We needed this wake-up call,
yeah.
and it's caused foundations and other giving organizations to really generate money towards social justice, towards equity and inclusion, and that's a positive sign. We're seeing organizations in business and industry taking seriously what these problems are and saying we've got to solve this, because if we don't solve this, we don't have the kind of quality of life that we suppose that we're trying to promote.
Yeah, and it's important to remember it's the systems that needed the wake-up call. There are many communities who've been well aware of this for a very, very long time.
I just wrote an article for a business magazine, and it's entitled "Call It What It Is, Trauma, and Then Start Dealing with It," because I think this is what's important for all of us. So that's our message. We've got a couple of the primary sources that we used in the presentation, but for a couple of educators, I think we're pretty much close on time. Yeah. So I think we've achieved our time frame, and I'm going to stop sharing and give us the opportunity for questions, but also for comments and suggestions where we're all learning together.
Yeah. Any questions you have would be welcome. We like to have dialogue about this. We are learning as we go, and as we get asked questions, it prompts our learning and contributes to others. So we welcome conversation.
So we're waiting for Tremise, who's our guardian angel overseeing this process for us. Yeah. If you have questions, she will share them with us.
It's been a pretty packed 4 days. They may be tired.
Indeed. Shirley, you might want to tell them a little bit about, she's teaching in a master's degree we have in trauma-informed education, but she's discovering, in particularly in education, that as teachers come to grips with trauma, it's having its own impact, and I'm particularly concerned about the vicarious trauma and secondary trauma, because I suspect many on this in this meeting now are working and probably experiencing it.
Yeah. So as we're in our we started our third cohort this May, but what we're finding is that the vicarious trauma that teachers are experiencing in the classroom as the children that they're teaching are expressing trauma. It's not only a vicarious trauma of that, but it's often opening up trauma that teachers are carrying with them. And so the whole master's program is turning out to be as much of a healing process, or the start of a healing process for many of them, as it is the cognition and understanding of trauma. And the two go hand in hand. It's pretty hard to talk about trauma without beginning to think about what's happened in your own life or the exposure that you yourself have had. So that's been it's an unusual master's program in that it really focuses on teaching, and many teaching master's programs focus on helping teachers become administrators. And this is a very different experience. Yeah.
And another one of the encouraging areas, we do not have any questions. So I've been urged to have you use the Q&A feature, or the chat box to give us any questions you might have. While you're preparing for that, one of the other areas that I'm very excited about is this kind of work in the criminal justice and the law enforcement field. Those people, clearly first responders, they see trauma and have that vicarious trauma experiences. But then they also enter into very tense, emotionally charged situations where it very well could be a person with a lot of trauma they're carrying, then intersects with a law enforcement official that and then you've got a flashpoint and you wonder why you have these kinds of problems. And that's why it's so important if we can teach law enforcement and criminal justice about trauma-informed practices. It clearly, and there are processes, specific ways to de-escalate a problem. And there was a question about slides, and yes, they will be available. I believe that that the Eat Smart, Move More will be providing that, and I think you'll also be able to view the session for up to a 6-month period.
Yeah. Excellent. Tremise just said they can also view it afterwards.
Yes.
Yeah, my perspective on police violence is that they are traumatized individuals can be attracted to that sort of work, and they carry that trauma in with them, and it's a tinderbox between police officers who are being run by. Do you think the use of ACEs scores will come into play in schools? You know, that's an interesting question. I know through our master's program, we're using much of that research and data in the work that we're doing in our coursework. Will it come into play at schools, in schools at large? And it will. I think that also becomes a policy issue, and the will of state education departments and districts to be able to start to think differently about these things. I mean, I know that much of what we talk about in this master's program is learning the language of children's behavior, and what may sound like an aggressive or an attempt to get control in a classroom by a child is really a language that we have to understand as a cry for help, that it is not there to threaten a teacher. It is not there to try to take control or authority away, and that in the act of trying to listen to that language and respond to it with trauma-informed responses is really the step that we have to take in order to help children manage some of these things that they take with them. Because simply expelling children or reacting with discipline alone is what is giving us the school to prison pipeline, and it disproportionately affects children of color again. So it is very much tied into the schools, and the need to use ACEs in that way is very important. Yes.
Well, and another thing that particularly bothers me within the economic realm is you hear people saying, "Oh, well, they just have to suck it up," pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. This is white privilege telling us that you had those opportunities, that many of these people not only have no opportunities, but now when you start thinking about how they've had that brain development because of the tense and violent environment in which they grow up, it isn't a pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. It's so much more than that.
Yes, and so question there about the inclusivity of the original ACEs study. So it was the amazing thing about it, it was a study that largely had participants who were middle class, largely white, educated, and seemingly the individuals doing very well. And my take on that is, if we're getting 7 out of 10 in that population, then what it means in our vulnerable populations is that it certainly is greater. I do know that there are further studies that have been done specifically in Black and Brown communities and on vulnerable populations, and I can get some of those citations to Tremise or Brandy Freeman as well, that I can provide for you. But yes, there's been now a couple generations of research that have begun to diversify itself into different areas of the population? Good question. And I just want to thank everybody for attending. It's been great to be here with you all. We're
And-
excited to present to you.
And it takes all of us. And
Yeah.
so we need to continue to learn and to cooperate and to think creatively. But particularly, we need to recognize that it is so disproportionate in those populations that are most vulnerable, and they need our support in every way.